Prager University, Dennis Prager has a history of being dishonest when it comes to atheism. He'll play a game. He'll say atheist, and then he'll say leftist, and then he'll say communist, basically implying that all leftist communists are atheists, and all atheists are leftist communists. Very dishonest. And recently he had Frank Turek on PragerU just to keep spreading lies and dishonesty about atheism. Frank Turek was basically very arrogant and judgmental in this segment that I'm about to show. So in response, I will not be holding back. This is going to be fun.
What's up, guys? This is Witt with PragerU. Today joined by Dr. Frank Turek, radio show host, author. You're here at Summit Ministries here in Manitou Springs. How you doing?
The great Summit Ministries.
The great. Fantastic.
Lining up with the great PragerU.
Yes.
I'm glad this is happening.
Thank you so much. And so just before we get started into everything, give us what you're doing here at Summit Ministries. And
we're trying to teach about 185 to 190 young kids every 2 weeks Christian worldview, apologetics, philosophy, so they're equipped to go out there and be great ambassadors for God.
And so what are the things that you've been speaking on?
I speak sometimes on a book I co-wrote called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Today I'm speaking on a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Mm-hmm. So, for example, atheists will say, well, there's too much evil in the world. And then we'll ask them, well, what do you mean by evil? You can't explain evil unless you're referencing good, but good doesn't exist in an objective way unless God exists. So when atheists are claiming there's too much evil in the world, they're actually stealing from God to say he doesn't exist.
Yeah. So Frank doesn't waste any time. He gets right into it, being very arrogant, very judgmental. Never mind the fact that in Sermon on the Mount there is a passage about not judging, so you won't get judged. Forget about that passage. I mean, he's just a typical Christian apologist, spreading the Bible on the table like a buffet, and then just picking and choosing what he wants to follow. And this whole thing about objective truth, this standard of truth, requires God. No, it doesn't require God, because there's never been God. What Frank Turek is talking about is not God. He's talking about a man claiming to speak for God. That's all God has ever been. That's all God's morality, God's truth has ever been. It's been a man claiming to speak for God. And so Frank believes that the men claiming to speak for God actually were speaking for God. But later on in this interview, you'll see where he's talking about people having different interpretations regarding what's in the Bible, meaning he really doesn't have this standard of truth. Because even in Christianity, there's so many different sects, there's so many different beliefs that there is no objective, total agreement on what's even in the Bible. So this is so flawed, but also so arrogant to be strutting around thinking that somehow he has a standard of truth that Confucius didn't have, that Socrates didn't have, that Lao Tzu didn't have, that somehow he has it. An extremely arrogant statement to make, because you know what? Christianity isn't the only religion out there. The terrorists on 9/11 believed that they had objective moral truth from God.
So they have to sit in God's lap to slap his face.
They have to sit in God's lap to slap his face. What a prick.
So I cover issues like that.
Yeah. If there was one thing that you wanted people to know who had never heard of Summit Ministries or who had never been here, what would be that?
I would want them to know, particularly if they're Christians, that about 3 out of every 4 of Christians who go to college walk away from the church once they leave the home. And one of the major reasons is intellectually they don't know why Christianity is true. Well, in 2 weeks, you can get really grounded coming here. Yeah. It's not going to answer all your questions, but it's about a very good education in 2 weeks as you can get right here at Summit.
And so imagine if you were speaking to a group of atheists here and you only had about 1 minute to explain something to them that you thought was the most valuable thing that they could get from the Bible or something to try and change their minds. What is that thing for you to these people?
The thing is that God is good, we are not, and God literally came to earth to sacrifice himself to save us. That would be what I would want to show them. I would want to say, God loves everybody, he cares about everybody, but he's perfectly just and we're not. So what does he do? He takes our punishment on himself so that we won't have to be punished. That's really what Christianity is about.
So God sent himself to be sacrificed to himself in order to save us from himself for the talking snake incident. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And God made us flawed even though he's perfect. A perfect God made man. And it says even in the Bible, realized he screwed up and so he had to drown everybody and start over. I'm sure that'll convince the atheists. That all makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's about God taking our punishment on himself, and all we need to do to garner the forgiveness is accept what Christ has done.
And why do you think that atheists push away from something like that? When it's explained by you or any of these other people here at Summit Ministries, I mean, it's so full of love and welcoming. And
Why do atheists push back when it's so full of love and welcoming? Yeah, God loves you, and if you don't love him back, he will burn you for all eternity. Real loving and welcoming.
forgiveness is what Christianity is really all about in a lot of ways. Why do you think the atheists are so keen to reject something like that? Because I was an atheist my whole life.
Well,
right?
here's a question I ask. Look, let me take you back when you first went to college, Will.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose I were to ask you this question the very first semester you were in college. Suppose I were to say, Will, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? What would you say?
Yes.
You would say yes.
Yeah.
Because I ask that question of a lot of atheists and they say no.
Really?
And why do they say no? Because they don't want there to be a God, because they want to be God of their own lives.
And this is just flat out wrong. It's not that atheists reject God. We reject the God of the Bible. Let's be specific. And we reject the God of the Bible because it's both intellectually and morally repulsive. Let's not forget what's actually in the Bible, something that Frank Turek will stay away from. He won't talk about how a woman who doesn't prove her virginity on her wedding night is supposed to be stoned to death. Doesn't talk about Moses, the moral lawgiver in the Bible, killing his own people for worshiping a golden calf, slaughtering Midianite civilians, children, mothers, grandmothers. Doesn't talk about any of these horrible, morally repulsive things in the Bible. But by all means, because you claim allegiance to a book that condones slavery and murder, please claim how you have moral, objective truth. This is what atheists reject. We reject the hate. We reject the insanity. That's not to say there isn't anything good in the Bible, but there's also things that are extremely ignorant, extremely hateful, and downright evil. So absolutely, we reject that. Now, if you took the Sermon on the Mount and got rid of everything before it and got rid of everything after it, then atheists really wouldn't have a problem. I think that represents actually the best of the Bible. So if you got rid of killing babies, for example, atheists would be more receptive.
See, they're not on a truth quest, they're on a happiness quest. And they think being free of God will make them happy. Now, some people have admitted this to me and admitted it in writing. For example, even the great philosopher Thomas Nagel from NYU says, it's not just that I don't believe in God, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be that way. He says, I have a cosmic authority problem.
Yeah.
And he said the same about some other atheists. So it's not always the case, but I found if I ask the question, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? A lot of people will hesitate and say no.
Yeah.
They don't want it to be true because they think God is going to get in the way of their happiness.
I see.
Frank Turek does this a lot. It's really dishonest. It's like, I know this guy. I know this atheist, and this is what he says, and then just tries to paint every atheist that way. I've been an outspoken atheist for 10 years. I don't know any atheist that rejects God because they want to be God, or they want to be happy, or they just want to do whatever. That is just an ignorant stereotype. Show the statistics, because anybody can play that game. Oh, this Christian I know would talk all the time about how they like killing puppies. So obviously this reflects all Christians. It's just such a dishonest game that Frank plays over and over again.
Yeah, I think the reason why I said yes is because I actually disagreed with a lot of atheists on, the fact that there is no objective truth. You know what I mean? That there is no truth. They say my truth. This. So that was something that I just disagreed with them on. And so for me, if there was something that was proven to be true and it was 100% factually accurate, then why would you not believe it? And why would you not want that to be the truth?
Sure.
You know what I mean? It doesn't seem like any other alternative would be better if that's the way that it is.
It's pretty odd that atheists would spend a whole bunch of money going to college to learn the truth that there's no truth.
Yeah.
Why would you go to college if there's no truth? What are you there to learn, right?
Yeah,
Of course, it's
exactly.
self-defeating to say there's no truth. It's like
Yeah.
saying I can't speak a word in English,
Yeah.
right?
Once again, he's just making this up to push out these ignorant stereotypes. Atheists don't say there is no truth. Now, there are some times where we say, we don't know. For example, how did the universe begin? We don't know. How did life begin? We don't know, because that is the honest answer. But I don't know any atheists that say there is no truth. And really, it depends on what's the question. There's questions that are mathematical. There's questions that are philosophical. So what is the question we're trying to answer?
So you're also talking about morality over this trip. So I kind of had a question, because I was unsure about this, and a lot of people say that we have a sense of morality within us, right? That we naturally know what's good and know what's bad, know that if we lie, we're doing something wrong, even if society never told us that. It's just inherently inside of us.
Right.
And then some people believe that you don't have any morality and we're kind of a blank slate, and we get a lot of our morals from the Bible, like in the sense of like men like get a lot of their morality in terms of sexual nature and things from the Bible and from rules and laws in society.
Nobody gets their morality from the Bible. Christians that are good are not good because of the Bible. They're good despite the Bible.
And if none of that was there, men would go crazy and be, sexual deviants in a lot of ways. What do you think about that?
Well, the Bible actually doesn't teach that you get your morality all from the Bible. It actually teaches, as Paul does in Romans chapter 2, he says, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. So everybody knows basic right and wrong because God has written it on our hearts. So whether you're a Christian or not, whether you've ever seen a Bible or not, you still know basic right and wrong. Now you can suppress it, you can go your own way, as many of us do, but you still know on the big issues what right and wrong is. In fact, if you needed a Bible or a special revelation of some kind of scripture to know right and wrong, then God was unjust for punishing the entire generation of Noah. They didn't know. They didn't have a Bible. He was unjust for punishing the Canaanites because they didn't have a Bible, right? The Bible may give you more details about right and wrong, and for Christians it's the New Testament, obviously, but you don't need the Bible to know basic right and wrong. It's written on our hearts.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Nothing Frank ever says makes any sense. So what he's saying is the Bible's irrelevant because people already know good and wrong, but actually that's not what the Genesis says. When you look at the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve didn't know right from wrong until they ate from the tree of knowledge, and then they received this divine wisdom. Now, what was so special about this wisdom from God, this knowledge of right and wrong? It had to be something very impressive, right? I mean, when you look at the great moral philosophers, when you look at Confucius, he talked about the definition of the ideal human being. When you talk about Socrates, he talked about what are the greatest virtues. But they were just humans. So what is this divine wisdom from God going to be? Well, Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, and the great divine wisdom is that they're naked and should put some clothes on. So it's not about being the most virtuous person or what are the most important virtues. The most important thing is to put on a pair of trousers. That's our divine knowledge from God.
It's so many, I get so many different answers to those kind of questions from a lot of different people. So it's always really interesting to hear.
Wait,
So
let me say one other thing about that,
Yeah,
because that's
yeah.
an interesting question, because it goes back to the founding of our nation,
Yeah.
too. Contrary to what some will say, Christianity, or I should say, America was not founded on Christianity.
I stand corrected. Sometimes Frank does say something that's true.
It was founded on the moral law consistent with Christianity.
No, that part's not true.
Yes, most of the founding fathers were Christians. There were some deists, obviously. Yes, descriptively Christianity, or I should say America was Christian, but not prescriptively. In other words, you didn't need to be a Christian to be in government, in the federal government. You did in some states. They required that, but Christianity was sort of the cultural background out of which the country came. But Thomas Jefferson and his other founding fathers brilliantly started the country on the moral law consistent with Christianity. He said, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He didn't say that you got to be a particular Christian or a particular believer. He just grounded our rights in God and allowed religious diversity and freedom to worship as you wanted to, because they came from England, as you know, and that was the problem over there. They tried to force the Church of England on people.
So, of course, we've heard this before, because the word creator exists in a Declaration of Independence, then somehow our country's tied to Christianity. The problem is, right after this passage, Jefferson writes, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the governed. And also, Thomas Jefferson was hardly somebody that they should be using as this Christian role model. He believed in nature's God. He didn't believe in miracles. He said the virgin birth story of Jesus was a myth. Now, what other Christian says that? What Christian today believes that the virgin story of Jesus was a myth? So Thomas Jefferson, obviously very different than the kind of Christian that Frank Turek said. And when you look at the foundation of this country, really it's philosophy. It's philosophy from the ancient Greeks, who developed the first democracy, philosophy from the ancient Romans, who developed the first republic long before they adopted Christianity as their religion. And by the way, if the ancient Romans didn't adopt Christianity, we wouldn't even know the name Christianity. We wouldn't know the stories of Jesus. We wouldn't have any of that. If they adopted the gods of ancient Egypt, we would have people like Frank Turek talking kind of the same way, but talking about Isis and Osiris. And instead of what we now call Egyptian mythology, it wouldn't be myth. It would still be a religion. At one time, it wasn't myth. For the people there, this is what they believed. It was religion. So a myth is a past religion, and a current religion is nothing more than a future myth.
So it was a brilliant way to have God-given moral rights without religious intolerance.
Yeah. When I go around campuses and speak, it's interesting you bring that up about the Founding Fathers. I give part of my talks usually are 3 ways to beat the left. And the second one is to make God great again.
How does that have anything to do with beating the left? Why don't you talk about the harm of leftist policies and the benefit of conservative policies? How about just keeping the conversation there?
Basically looking at how America was founded exactly on those principles, and that the Founding Fathers knew that you don't get your rights, your morals from the government, you get them from God.
Exactly.
And I think that that's like a major issue right now in colleges in America. I mean, these kids, like I'm 22 years old, I'm not that much older than them, but when I was going through high school or when I was even going through college, I never heard anything like this, you know, or anything that like you're saying or any of the other speakers are saying. It's like, it's a blessing for me to be here and like, and hear all this stuff.
I was really surprised he's never heard this stuff before. Do you not have access to YouTube? Do you not have access to Google? How could you not have heard these things before? How could you be new to this? That just blows my mind. But when it comes to our rights do not come from God. Ideally, our rights come from the greatest moral reasoning of mankind. And those rights are written into laws, and those laws are enforced by law enforcement. And that's a big discussion. But basically, your rights can be taken away, and God's not going to do anything about it.
But I've never, that if I would have heard it when I was younger, I feel like I would have had a different life through my, growing up years when I was.
Well, the point you bring up about rights is so critical, because if there's no God, there's no right to anything.
Yeah.
That is just completely not true. Imagine an ancient society where some people are sitting around and one person looks at the other and says, you know what? I don't want to be murdered. Do you? No, I don't want to be murdered either. Here's an idea. Let's make a law against murder. Let's put our heads together, our human brains together, our moral reasoning together, and say that we all here have a right not to be murdered. It's really not that difficult. There is no imaginary being required in order to put together something like that.
And yet you have so many people out there on the left who are atheists arguing they have certain rights. Says who?
Yeah.
We do have the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, we do have the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Both of these documents talking about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. You will not find freedom of religion in the Bible. The First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is a direct contradiction to the First Commandment in the Bible. The First Commandment in the Bible says, "You shall have no God but the God of Abraham." That is not the philosophy that we enjoy in this society. The exact opposite. That religious freedom doesn't exist in the Bible. So that's what we go by. We go by the laws that were created by men, and either you can believe these men were really smart and represent the greatest moral thinking of mankind, or you can say, oh, this man was somehow, you think, speaking for God somehow more than the millions of other men making the same claim. But whatever, in either scenario, you can claim to have rights.
If there's no God, everything's just a matter of opinion. It's just your opinion against, say, Hitler's opinion, if there's no God. Right. But if there's a standard beyond us, God's nature, then we can judge our society to say be better than the Nazi society. If God doesn't exist, you couldn't say we were better than the Nazis.
Through moral reasoning, you can say that our society is better than the Nazis. No imaginary sky daddy required.
Because there is no good or best. If there's no best, you can't say we're better or worse if there's no standard. So God must exist for there to be rights for anything. So I always ask people, what's your standard of morality? Where are you getting these rights from?
Well, that would be a standard that doesn't condone slavery and murder. How do you know murder is wrong if your God's okay with murder? How do you know that slavery is wrong if your God's okay with slavery? How do you know that rape is wrong if your God's okay with rape? I mean, it's amazing that he speaks with such arrogance, like he has this great moral standard of which everything else must be judged. But he's talking about the Bible, one of the most morally repulsive books, morally repulsive literature ever written. I mean, it's just, it's comical.
That goes in with the whole idea of cultural relativism now, which is, the left, a lot of people claim that all cultures are equal and everyone is kind of the same.
Except the Christian culture.
Yeah, exactly, right? Exactly, the most persecuted religion in the world. So what do you think about cultural relativism at all?
Well, it's obviously false because they're basically saying that there's no way to make moral judgments between cultures. So you're saying that we're no better than the Nazis? Are you saying we're no better than back in the middle of the last century when in the culture in India, they would burn the living wife of the dead husband on the funeral pyre. Yeah, something like I can't remember the exact name of it, but and the British went over there and said, no, you're not going to do this anymore. This is wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't make moral judgments between cultures if there is no standard beyond humanity. And we all know certain cultures are better than others. In fact, what do these same atheists do? They claim the culture of the Old Testament, where God is killing the Canaanites and all these things. That was evil and wrong. Wait, you said you can't judge cultures. How come you're judging the Old Testament culture then?
Yeah.
Right?
So you see what he did here. This is the Dennis Prager trick. Did you see? They talked about this leftist view, this far leftist view that of culture relativism, which I'm completely against. This notion that one culture isn't better than the others. That is absolute nonsense. I'm completely against that. But notice they talked about the far left view and then went into atheists. Like that has something to do with atheists. Like the far leftists that have this view is somehow tied to atheism, and atheists have that view. Now, I could have a conversation about this and agree with them on how ridiculous that is. And obviously there are cultures that are superior to others. But I'm just put in the same basket by this dishonesty. Dennis Prager, same thing. He'll say atheist, then he'll say leftist, then he'll say communist. Just playing this game like they're all the same thing. They're all one and the same. And here's Frank Turek pulling off the same dishonesty.
Well, those are the only people that are allowed to.
That's right. That's right.
Looking at, take a step back, going back to you're talking about Darwinism too, and a lot about that. So I'm a fan of Stephen Meyer. I'm sure you know Stephen Meyer.
Most of my
Great guy.
lectures just based on what Stephen Meyer has said.
Yeah,
He's the real expert. I'm standing on his shoulders.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I guess in that sense, when we were talking about morality within people and how it's kind of endowed in us that we have, a certain level of right and wrong, do you attribute any of that to evolutionary processes that throughout history and humans becoming, through thousands of years, that some of those things might be because of traits that actually make them better? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But you see, there's a difference between how you know something and that something exists.
Yeah.
If we get our moral sentiments from some sort of evolutionary process, then they're not really objective. They're just preferences. What we're saying is, regardless of how we came to know, say, murder's wrong, murder really is wrong because there's a standard beyond humanity that's God's nature, and He has endowed us with His image, which means we have great worth, and it would be wrong to end the life of another human being made in God's image. If God doesn't exist and there is no standard beyond us, then we can't say that murder is wrong. So it's not an epistemological question, to use a fancy word, that's how you know something. It's an ontological question. Why does this thing known as righteousness exist? It can only exist if God exists. Otherwise, it's all just preference. You like chocolate, I like vanilla.
So, once again, Frank Turek seems to think that the God of the Bible has a problem with murder. Apparently, he's never actually read it.
So we can argue all day about how we came to know murder's wrong. That's not the question. The question is, why is murder wrong? If we're just overgrown germs, if we're just molecular machines, if we're just moist robots, as the atheists like to say.
I don't know one atheist that says we're moist robots. I have not heard that term before. What the hell?
Then why is it wrong to kill another human being?
Yeah.
Who said?
Yeah.
You said? Suppose Hitler comes along and he says, no, I want to kill you and take your stuff and make the super race. Why is he wrong if there's no standard beyond you and Hitler?
Right, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so I guess the question that has been evolution for me, becoming a religious person, has been the hardest thing that I've struggled with. Because I tried to do a lot of research on it, and a lot of people who are my followers disagreed with me on a lot of stuff when I said it in my audience. I guess how would you answer the question about the Precambrian rabbit? Have you heard of that before? In the sense
why don't we find a rabbit in the Precambrian? Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there may be reasons why we have gone from simple life to complex life without an evolutionary process. It could be that God individually created these things at different time periods, or if you're taking the theistic evolution route, that He's inputting information at different points. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, macroevolution is true. Does that mean Christianity's false?
See, that's what I say. I think that macroevolution can be true without Christianity being false, and that God is the one who again, like you were saying with the designer, is the one who created these processes that would happen.
I'm a little confused because it seems like Frank Turek's asking different questions and putting different possible scenarios out there. But what happened to his objective truth? I mean, doesn't he have this standard to measure all things against? How could he not know whether or not evolution is true or not? Why is he asking these questions? Why does he have opinions that are different than other Christians? Obviously, evolution is true. It did happen. I'm glad they're on the Christian side. So if you're religious, but you have a liberal interpretation of your literature, so if you're a Christian and you have a liberal interpretation of the Bible, that leaves room to keep up with modern science. If you have a dogmatic interpretation of the Bible, then that'll leave you ignorant. You'll have blinders on and you won't be able to accept and keep up with modern science. So it's good that he's on the more liberal side, but obviously this is a big difference, and evolution presents a problem, because if evolution is true, which it is, there is no Adam and Eve. That's just a bunch of myths. Or people can say, oh, that's just a story not to be taken literally. But then once again, you have these different interpretations, and you have these different interpretations, then what is that moral standard? It just kind of fades away. This also gets into a point that I wanted to make about the history. When you look at the history, when you look at Moses, most Egyptologists agree that the Pharaoh referenced, Ramses the Great, is Ramses II. And we can date that. So there's historical characters in the Bible. Now, a lot of people say, well, that proves the Bible it's real. No, it doesn't prove the Bible it's real. Reading a Spider-Man comic and seeing New York mentioned, well, New York is real, but that doesn't mean the Spider-Man comic, the Spider-Man is real. So that really doesn't mean anything. But going back to this historical Ramses II, whose mummy is on display. So if you want to see a historical character from the Bible, you can Google it, Ramses II. See Ramses, what's remaining of his corpse. He existed, to get you to understand the historical context. The pyramids had been standing for 1,000 years. So there is no Book of Moses. There is no Old Testament. This story begins 1,000 years after the pyramids were created. Now think about the society that built the pyramids. You think they didn't know not to kill each other? How could they have built the pyramids if everybody killed each other? And also, when we talk about evolution, we're talking about survival of the fittest. What will help us survive from generation to generation? Well, how about a mother's love for her child? Isn't that going to help with survival? Doesn't that make sense from an evolutionary perspective? What makes humans different from the other animals is our offspring our youth takes longer to become adults. The adolescence, that period of time is greater than any other animal. When you think about an infant, that infant's helpless for a long time. That infant's going to need care, protection, love. So from an evolutionary perspective, that this love that we hold dear as being moral, as being good, well, obviously there's an evolutionary reason for that to happen. Also, cooperation, strength in numbers, and also on the bad side, you can say, yes, greed and some of these things we consider bad from an evolutionary perspective could help in survival. And that is why we have both. This is an evolutionary, our history of evolutionary struggle is why we have traits that we consider good and bad. It can be explained through that perspective much better than these ancient ridiculous myths written by ignorant bigots. But once again, look at the history. How did the Egyptians build the pyramids 1,000 years before this thou shalt not kill commandment? Obviously, they knew that murder was wrong because dead people do a horrible job pulling stones and building pyramids.
He's not only created the processes, if indeed he is behind a macroevolutionary process, but he's also behind the natural laws which drive the macroevolutionary process. The very laws of nature, the four natural forces we know about, the strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, and gravity. As we'll see in the lecture later today, I know you folks here might not see that, but there's no way to get information from those four forces. Information has to be input into the system at some point. Now, personally, and standing on the shoulders of Stephen Meyer, there are so many hurdles that macroevolutionary theory can't get over unless somebody intervenes that I think it's an implausible theory. Not only irreducible complexity, genetic limits to change, epigenetic information, which is what Meyer talked about in his recent book, Darwin's Doubt. Yep. All these things make it seem implausible that macroevolutionary theory could be true. But even if it is true, the forces, the complex, I should say, the precise and consistent natural laws that drive the whole process were created and sustained by God anyway. So
I'm surprised you brought up irreducible complexity because that argument was debunked years ago. But I could already tell you what his lecture is going to be. It's going to be a God of the gaps. We don't know, therefore God did it. It must have been God, and specifically it must have been the God of Christianity. It must have been these people claiming to speak for God that really were speaking for God more than the millions of other men making the same claim. And this is something else that Prager University does a lot of, these God of the gaps videos. We don't know, therefore God did it. That's really all they boil down to.
Fine, you want to believe in macroevolution, go ahead. You're not defeating Christianity.
Yeah, that's exactly what I believe too, so that's perfect. I guess I'll end on this question. It's one that I've been thinking about recently, wrestling with. And a lot of Christians who I talk to believe in, God's plan. God has a plan for everyone. Is that something that you would say you kind of believe in too?
There are two major views on God's will.
Yeah.
One view is called the traditional view, where God has a certain person he wants you to marry, a certain job he wants you to have, and you've got to go out there and find all this, right? You got to put out fleeces, you got to look for little hints and clues. The other view is, no, God gives you a general moral window in which you need to act. Like, for example, when it comes to marrying somebody, just marry somebody who's a Christian. Whoever you pick in that window, you've created God's will in your life. I take that view, even though a majority of Christians would take the traditional view.
But what's the objective moral truth there, Frankie boy? I mean, what's the true answer?
And the reason I take that view is because I think it makes more sense of the scripture. I mean, why would you even have, say, a book of Proverbs if God was going to tell you what to do every day?
Yeah.
And why is it so cryptic? Why are we trying to, if God really wants to tell you something, he could, right? He doesn't have to try. He could just say, hey, Will, marry her now, right? But if he were to do that, it would create an immaturity in us, or let me put it another way, it would retard our maturity if God was telling us what to do every moment. Like if your parents told you throughout your entire adult life, do this, don't do this, do this, do it. If they gave you general principles and said, you're an adult now, you got to make your own decisions, but here are the general principles you need to live by, go ahead and live by them, then you can become a mature adult. But if God is telling you what to do every single moment of the day with every decision, you don't become mature. You become so dependent, and you never really become like Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong. Jesus is dependent on the Father in a certain sense, and so are we. He's the vine, we're the branches. But I think that God gives you a window in which you need to make a decision. As long as it's within his moral will, it can be your will or his will for your life.
So here's a scenario. An area that's prone to tornadoes, and there's two schools. One has an underground tornado shelter, the other doesn't. A tornado hits both schools. One of the schools, kids die. One of the schools, they don't. Obviously, the school with the underground tornado shelter, the kids are safe. The other one, they die. Prayer doesn't matter. It doesn't matter which school prayed more. What mattered was preparation. So Frank Turek takes the side where, and if you heard it a lot, God helps those who helps themselves. So it's the way to say that, I believe that God's all-knowing and everything is his will, but at the same time, we have to prepare and we have to make sure we're ready in order for survival. So it's kind of a way, I guess, to act like there is no God, but still claim that there is a God.
So I guess my question is, you can tell me if this doesn't make sense or not. But if God is omnipotent and knows everything, that would mean that essentially that he would know the future of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't that take away our free will if God already knows everything that is going to happen? That everything is already set out for us?
No, because if you were to do something different, he would have known that as well. In other words, we're chosen but free. Just because he knows what we're going to do doesn't mean we don't have free will. I mean, think about it this way. Suppose you're in a helicopter over a major city and you see two cars coming between the buildings. They can't see one another, but they're on a collision course. You know, if something doesn't change, there's going to be a collision. But are you causing that collision?
Are you doing anything to stop the collision?
No, just because you know what's going to happen doesn't mean you're causing it. Similarly, God is outside of time. He knows what we're going to do before we do it, but that doesn't mean that he's causing us to do it directly. In effect, sometimes I use this illustration. Suppose you love football and you're videotaping a game, you're DVRing a game because you can't watch it that day, and you get home to watch it and your friend texts you the score and you go, man, I didn't want to know the score. I wanted to watch it as if it was live. But you already know the score. You elect to watch the game anyway. As you're watching the game, you know what the outcome's going to be. But does that mean the players on the field don't have free will?
No, they don't have free will because they're not players on the field. The game's already over. So God cannot be all-knowing and omnipotent. If God knows what he's going to do tomorrow at noon, and that can't change, then he has no choice but to do whatever that's going to happen at noon tomorrow, meaning he's not omnipotent. So you can't be both. It's like being a married bachelor.
No.
No, you still have free will.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Just because you know what they're going to do doesn't mean you're forcing them to do it. So knowledge does not necessarily imply causality in that sense. So God can know all things. He knew we were going to be here talking. If we had decided not to be here talking, he would have known that scenario too. But he knew we'd be here, and so here we are. But we're freely talking right now.
Would have been nice if he stopped by, made an appearance.
Despite the fact that God always knew it would happen.
We could talk on for hours. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I really
Will.
appreciate
Thanks
it.
for what you're doing.
Actually,
great stuff at PragerU. Keep it going.
That was very insightful for me. Actually, really learned a lot. So thank you. For that.
Good.
I really
Absolutely.
appreciate it. And so
yeah.
Thank you guys for watching. We appreciate it.
And thank you for watching. And we're talking about atheism. We're talking about not belief in God. That is completely different than somebody being on the far left or being a communist. There's actually Prager University videos that I do agree with. They have a video about how the Civil War was absolutely about slavery, which it was. It's completely true. Some people say, oh no, it's about state rights. Yeah, state rights about what? Slavery. Yeah, exactly. And so there's certain conservative viewpoints that I do have. And the thing is, the left has moved so far to the left that people that were center and are now still center they haven't changed their views, are finding themselves on the right. Like now you see Obama being attacked for being tough on illegal immigration, where it used to be both Republicans and Democrats were tough on illegal immigrants. So the political landscape has changed. And to just try to do this, paint with a broad brush and in a stereotyping and say that all atheists are these leftist communists, it's very insulting. It's not necessary. There's actually outspoken popular atheist YouTubers that are conservative. So having this divisiveness in the population just makes absolutely no sense. So it would be nice if these people would wise up and understand the difference between leftism and atheism. Not the same thing. This is Jim Wall. Thanks for watching. Until next time.
Cisco, do we have to leave all our good friends now?
Only until next time, Pancho. Adios, amigos.